can have a quick run through all of the various settings on the UltraLight. It does take a few minutes to go through them all, but I will break it up into chapters. If you're looking at this in the early days, there may or may not be chapters, but there will be at some point. So check back regularly, and any updates and chapter breakup will be added. The scene you're looking at here is the default demonstration scene that opens up when you open up the project. You'll see I'm working with version 1.3, but everything you'll see in here is the same in version 1.2, currently available on the Epic Marketplace. So I think for simplicity's sake, we will just delete all of these lights and start fresh. Gotta make it easy. There's one large overhead light, which you can see is creating the big general fill, I think I called it. Here. I'm just going to leave that one on so we can see what we're doing as we're working. So in order to add an UltraLight, it's in the blueprints folder. This is your main vanilla neutral version of the light. There are a couple of presets saved here that are child blueprints. I will show you how to save those a bit later. But these ones, when you create them, they do rearrange the order of the parameters in the listing, so it's easier to start with a neutral one at this stage of things. So we can just drag and drop that in the scene, and we'll just position it somewhere where we can see what it's doing in the shot, and you can see it in the viewport as well. It's just sort of situated here in this large scene, but by tapping F, we can zoom in on it and navigate our way around. You can see by default, it starts with the basic box shell. Let me just drag my details tab in here so you guys can see this as well. And here you'll find all the base level parameters for the light. There are, as I said, quite a few. Try not to be too intimidated. Most of them are very straightforward, and there's a lot of repetitive functions. So you'll see the same parameter options or variables available for a linear gradient and a radial gradient. They're just in different places. A lot of these also replicate the light controls that are built into the Unreal lights. They're just positioned here on the blueprint level to make them easier to access. So to begin with, your activation tab is where you'll turn off and on all the basic components of the light, which you will see in the component list up here. By default, the light plane is activated and the shell is activated. So the shell is just a geometry shape. This is kind of a convenience thing. Sometimes you might want to see those in the shot. They do add a little bit of realism, but they also sometimes just get in the way of doing traditional 3D lighting. So for my own workflow, a lot of times I just turn that off and work with the light plane. But it's there if you need it. You can turn on a rectangle light. You can use a spotlight. You can use a point light. The Gobo plane is also turned on here. We'll come back to this one later and talk a little bit about that. It's a very powerful tool. The UltraLight is set up by default to be a single-sided light plane. When you rotate it around, you'll see it has a black backface. That's just a convenience so that when you're working with them in the scene, you can actually see the lights when they're not facing camera. But if you did want that to be hidden, first off, you have to switch away from the opaque material. This is one of the three options you have for the light plane material. Opaque is the cheapest, and it's the one that makes sense when you're using shell geometry, because the light itself is a solid object. But sometimes you want a transparent or semi-transparent light. That's when you would want to switch to this one here. Then you can still have two-sided, but back of the light is invisible in this case. If you find that, and I often do, hard to find that in the scene, and when you're messing around later on, it's easy sometimes just turn on the backface visibility option, which we'll see where it is in a moment, just so that that light is easier to spot. So that's your basic activation options. When you turn on the lights, you'll notice actually nothing much happens right away, except with the Gobo plane. By default, when you look at the intensities, which is down here, we'll come back to targeting in just a moment. The intensities are set for 1, which is master override and light intensity. The rest are turned off by default. So the light plane intensity controls the brightness of the light plane, and it will affect the brightness of the base color, textures, gradients, everything that you apply to it cumulatively will be affected by the light plane intensity. This set of controls is for the lights themselves. So if we activate the rect light, then we have to dial up the rectangular light to an appropriate level. Same thing with the spotlight. And same thing with the point light. And interestingly, you can use them all at the same time. So you can create quite complex light sources by having interesting shaped light planes and using a mixture of spotlights and point lights, or point lights and rect lights, to create complex interactions of soft light and fill. You can have a spotlight that's creating its, an intense core, and have the rectangle light turned on to act as a fill light for it, to create like a softer backfill. You can also select them once they're created by activation. You can go in here and adjust these separately from the light itself. So you can have your spotlight aimed separately from where the reflection is. You might want to position the light so that the reflection's sitting in a nice place, but you want to bring the pool of light down into a different area. That's how you would do it. Now, because there are so many parameters here, it's easy sometimes to just use the typed in list and sub filter things down to a handful of controls. So typing in intensity will bring up the general intensity for all lights. That's a quick way to kind of get in there. So this is something I do quite a bit, using the rect light and the spotlight together. I often will get in there and take the rect lights also and rotate them separately from the light. You can also move them and reposition them so you can get kind of different effects. If you go back to the full blueprint level, you can then grab the whole thing and it still moves as a unit. This is a really powerful way to build complex lighting effects that are actually really quite simple. And of course, you can always turn the light plane off, and then you just have basic Unreal lights, which are linked together in space and have a lot of common parameters. For example, the global tint, which we can come down to, we can swing the color here, and it's going to change the light color for the rectangle light and the point light and the spotlight all at the same time. So it's kind of easier than just having separate root Unreal lights that you drag and drop yourself. And then again, you always have that ability to convert a light. If you wanted to just start with a rect light and you decide later that you want it to be a spotlight, you can simply turn that on. And you'll notice the icon sometimes doesn't update. You just have to click on it, click off again, and then the sprite will show the correct light source. Anyway, it's a quick way to flip between light types without having to reposition or reline things up. And you can go back and forth. And again, mixing and matching, one of my favorite things to do. So for now, let's just turn those off to keep things easy. And we'll turn the light back on. I'm going to go back to the opaque material by default and click on the shell geometry. So you'll see there is a set of basic shapes. Basic box is a square box. Basic box 2, you'll see there's 2 of each version. The basic box, hex box, octo, and dish are all sort of mathematically perfect shapes, perfect squares, perfect hex, perfect rectangle, perfect octagon. The second version there has some organic deformations to the surface. So there's some undulations to the light plane surface, the diffuser surface, if it was an actual light box, as well as to the silhouette. So that's to give you a much more natural, more realistic looking reflection when that's what you're after. So if you want really clean highlights or reflections, you would use the first version. And for more realistic, you can choose the second version. Dish gives you a round light. Dish 2 is just slightly deformed again, similar to like an inflatable or collapsible softbox. One thing to note is that the size will differ a little bit when you switch between them. They're not exactly the same size. They're all based around a 1 meter square, but the size is slightly different. So you might need to do a little bit of scaling when you switch between them, because the scale is measuring from a different point on the flat sides versus the corners. So the octo boxes are slightly larger. The dish is larger, but the basic box is a little bit smaller. Very, very minor thing, but just something to take note of. All the rest of the parameters work with any of these shapes. And again, you don't need to use the shape. You can turn it off, in which point the shell shape will just change the shape of the flat light plane that you're working with. And it does still maintain the organic shapes if you wanted to use those as well. Perfectly okay to do that. Dish, if you want a round one as a starting point. Dish 2 and so on. I'll leave the shell geometry on. They are kind of fun to look at that way. Again, they're kind of, it's a convenience thing in some respects too. It just makes them easy to see and identify visually. If you're familiar with studio lighting, it'll feel more familiar to be able to just look at the light and grab it and move it around and get a sense of the size of it. So it's there if you need it, but they will cast shadows by default. There is an option you'll see further down to turn that off, but they will interfere with each other, and they create sometimes reflections and things that photographers and lighters are trying to get rid of in the real world, because the grip equipment, it's not something you necessarily want to see in the shot. So being able to turn that off and on gives you that ability to create that perfect CG world or a more realistic studio sort of environment. All right, let's talk about targeting. This is a very useful little tool. If we switch on target light, the light will orient itself to whatever is selected as a target. You do have to select a target. You can use the eyedropper and pick an object out of the scene. You can also just choose it from a list here. It works the same either way. One of the handier things I find is to create an actual target object. We'll look at that in just one sec. Once you're in the targeting mode, I do recommend switching from local orientation to global coordinates as a easier way to maneuver the light around and not have it kind of go too crazy. Sometimes the math that's driving that orientation of the light source can lose its mind a little bit when you're moving it around on its own axis. So switching to global works quite nicely. This is a really handy tool for doing quick initial lighting setups. I do find that it because you can't change the orientation of the light relative to the subject when it's in this mode, it is a little bit limited. So for example, if this is where we wanted it to be in general, we do a quick setup, we can always turn targeting off, and then we can access it again, and it's, back to being its own adjustable light. So we can get in here, and within that position now we can play with its orientation and change the shape of the highlight. Maybe we want something a little more like that, as just an example. One of the things that I do like to do is to set, or not here, where's my targeting, is to choose an actual target, create an object. It can just be an empty actor. If you open up this scene by default, you will find one in there. That little target, let's just make sure that targeting is turned on. Once that is selected, sometimes the way to orient it is to just move your target around and navigate that separately. Can also be a nice quick way to, have quick control of the position of light without having to move the light itself or the subject. Either one works. Sometimes it's just a complex object that you have here, and picking a piece of it. If I wanted to put the light and have it aim at some character's nose, for example, but the pivot point is down around the waist, creating a target and putting it up around the nose allows just like you would with a targeted camera, allows you to control the position of the light more accurately. But again, it's not necessary. Intensities we've already talked about. The one that we didn't talk about was the master intensity. This one will be more obvious once we've done some work with the lights themselves and created some more complex light planes. But what it does control is it acts as a master multiplier for all of the light intensities. So the light plane surface, the emitted material that's on that, and any or all of the lights. So if you get a nice balance between the brightness of your reflection and the brightness of the light, let's say we like this amount of light, but we want the reflection to be a bit brighter, we can tone that up and down without changing the light, which is one of the key reasons I like having my light source and my reflection source being separate objects. So I can have light without a reflection, I can have reflections without light, and I can control the intensity of those things much better. When you're shooting or rendering shiny objects like this, mostly what you're doing is creating pictures of your light sources as they reflect in your subject. So the quality and the brightness of the reflections becomes extremely important. And being able to separate that from the lighting so you can control how that's affecting more diffuse surfaces is very, very useful. Anyway, once you've got that balance the way you want it, you can now use the master intensity to brighten or darken them together and bring them up and down as a unit. So you build that ratio between the two. And it affects all the lights too. So if we have a spotlight that's doing its thing over here, the master intensity will affect all of them. So it's just a multiplier. It's defaulted to 1, so it's not really doing anything. But it's very, very useful once you've got that ratio built. Default editor tick, this is just a little utility that's necessary for the targeting. You can ignore that. It doesn't do anything. The global light plane adjustments gives you contrast, brightness, saturation, and a tint control that affects the light plane material in its totality. So that's the base color, any textures that get applied, any raw gradients and adjustments, the alpha, everything that you do to it that makes it into its own custom light source. On top of that, you can tweak the contrast, brightness, and saturation, add a tint, and invert the whole image. When it's just white, it just makes it go black. And doing these adjustments on it don't really have a lot of difference than the overall brightness itself. The light intensity or light plane intensity, the utility of this will be more apparent later. We can come back to it after. Same thing with using Composited as alpha. This doesn't show a whole lot when, well, it won't do anything at all unless we're using a transparent material. Turn the shell off. Just quickly to show what this does though, let's turn on the radial gradients. We'll come back to this after. We turn that on. Let's crank up the scaler. So we've got a radial gradient happening. If we turn that off and go back to our alpha, using Composited as alpha, it will now read the black values or the dark values of that light plane and transfer it to an alpha. So it will accept the base color multiplied by the texture, multiplied by whatever gradients, and then takes the channel of that and use it as an alpha. So it has also its own separate contrast and brightness so that you can control how that interpretation of the luminosity values of the light is affecting it as an alpha. You can also, if you wanted to, put an additional alpha map as a cutout on top of it. So let's see if we've got a checkerboard in here somewhere. Sure. There. So you can add another opacity map to cut it out. This is handy for things like if you're making a neon sign, if you want the light to be a neon sign, you can use a texture map on the light plane to create the light, and you can use the gradients to create all kinds of subtle fall off within it, and then clip the whole thing with a shape mask. So if you wanted your light shape to not be a perfect rectangle or octagon or hex, etc., you can build complex gradients, have a nice semi-transparent surface, and then use a custom texture to clip the light into whatever shape you want. Again, that is also affected by the contrast. Casting shadows. By default, the light plane is set to not cast shadows. That's just a convenience thing. Usually, these lights are used for my own workflow, often in complex combinations where lights are in front of other lights, adding little hot spots and dark spots, and I don't necessarily want them casting shadows from the other lights in the scene, but you can certainly turn that on. And though there isn't much of a light in here to show it, that light plane would cast a shadow. You also have the controls for the light sources, the Unreal light sources that are components. Those can be turned off and on here as well. They are accessible from the component level. All the full range of controls that you're used to with an Unreal Light are accessible if you access them from this list here. But having them here just gives you one place to go to toggle everything off and on. And the shell geometry, shadow casting is here as well. So again, by default, the shell casting is on and all of these lights are on, but the light plane is off. The light plane tab, the next bunch of tabs are large sections. So we have three major sections. We have the light plane controls, the Unreal lights themselves, and the Gobo. The light plane starts with a base color, which you can tint any way you like. If you choose to use a texture, you can add something there. Send that checkerboard again. And it is tinted by this texture. It's a multiplier on it. So, multiplying green by other colors will make you go dark, but you get the idea. There we go. This will be more obvious, black and white map. So you can tint the texture from here. You don't have to. If you want, you can set it so that the texture is applied over top of the base color. This is only handy in a few cases. You generally won't need to use this, but if you're using a lowered texture opacity, you're just using it to add a little bit of breakup to but you really just want the base color and you don't want the multiplication, you can just turn off the tinting. You'll see it creates a slightly different effect. If you wanted to get a subtle overlay type of effect, it's harder to get with the tint because the tint is a multiplier, so you can just turn that off and then just blend straight opacity. It's pretty minor stuff, but it can be handy. And then being able to invert the texture, we'll just set this back to 1. Won't necessarily show there because it's a multiplier, but once we go down here and change the brightness, in some cases that'll be more obvious than others. Use the grid. So we got that. I'm just going to leave that grid on now. It's kind of an easy way to see what's going on. Reset our color here. Reset that to default. Turn that off. So texture controls, these are pretty standard. Some things have been added to customize to make things a little easier. You've got your base tiling, X and Y, and also a global tiling. It does the same thing. If you set the X and Y separately to 2, it's the exact same thing as setting global to 2, and these at 1. It's just sometimes nice to use the X and Y as controls to create, a particular fit or stretch, and then be able to scale the whole thing up and down. Let's say we want to get something like that. Having both is handy. You've got texture offsets in both directions, and you can also rotate it. Once you've done the offsets, the point of rotation is the center of the image. It'll start getting a little bit funky, so maintaining the texture in the center will do a better job. And odd tilings will also do the same thing. If it's set at 1 and 1, it will just pivot around the center. But once you start changing the tiling less than 1 to 1, 1 and 1, or adding any offset, then the rotation point will move around a little bit as well. Just something to be aware of. You just have to compensate for it. If we wanted to, stretch it a little bit, and then rotate it, then you just have to play with the offsets to put it back where you want it, if you needed to do that. Pretty straightforward stuff. Texture brightness. Let's use something that's more obvious for this one. Sure. Texture brightness control, just a straight multiplier. You've got contrast control. You can change your saturation. The blur level is a really nice one when you want to create just sort of subtle patterns on the light. Just to create, just some interesting breakup in there without adding any detail. The blur level is really handy. You've also got blur quality, 2 different controls here. By most cases, the defaults work just fine. Once in a while, you'll start to see artifacts if you're doing a really high-res render and you're blurring something that has a really defined pattern. Sometimes that will need to be adjusted up a little bit. See if we can see it here. Setting this to a lower number, it gives you a cheaper blur, but less of a smooth blend. This, interestingly though, can be used to create some pretty cool patterns by messing around with these qualities and create some kind of interesting effects, artifacty looking light sources. So I've put this in as a quality control, but I've ended up using it mostly as a creative tool, just messing around, creating breakup in my light sources. A lot of professional lighting is creating unevenness and controlled breakup and chaos in the lights to make them look more natural and to define shapes better. So all of these tools serve that end. Next section is the noise section. This is a overlay pattern that's used to create breakup. If you want to create your own artificial light boxes and just interesting light sources, having textures you can multiply across. It doesn't have to be a noise. You can multiply anything across here if you wanted to. It's just a straight black and white multiplier, luminosity multiplier. You can tint the whole thing here. By default, it's a black and white. But using low-res blurred noise, it has all the same controls that we just saw for the texture above. The one thing that I do quite a bit is blur the noise, play around with the scale, stretch it in one direction or another. Just a way of creating a little subtle undulation in the light source. Sometimes it's better to create something that's more obvious so you can see what it's doing. Blur just a little bit more and then knock it back so that it's just something subtle happening in the light that just makes it feel a little bit more realistic, a little bit more interesting. That's pretty much what the noise is for. You can find all kinds of uses for it when you're creating soft radial shapes like little glowing blobs and candle flames, things like that. It's very handy for that as well. But the principal purpose is just breaking up. The frame is actually more obvious perhaps on a box shape for a starting point, just for simplicity's sake. It creates a black frame around the image by default. It can also be done this way to create a box in the middle, similar to a Gobo. This is a way you can, if you just use a light plane without the shell, you can create the look really quickly of having a softbox, the shell geometry around it without actually having the shell geometry, just having that little black border. gives a slightly more realistic looking reflection. So I use that quite a bit, just for that alone. By default, it's linked. The X and Y sides are linked. So when you play around with the contrast, it's affecting both. And you can use the offset to control how far into the shot it goes. You can also rotate it. But you can also turn that off, and then you have separate control over the X and the Y. And they can be rotated separately as well. So you can use this to create really highly customized cutout shapes. If we go back to using the alpha, you can use it as a cropping tool to create funky shapes. And then by dropping the contrast, you can create just soft, really soft edge, glowing little highlights that create soft reflections in your scene. I do this quite a bit. A lot of times what I'll do is also use this as a tool. I'll put another light in behind it. That's my main light source. And I don't want that to be quite as bright for this case. So I'll take the light plane intensity down. And then I can use this cropped version to create a little organic hotspot in front of that light. When I'm using it this way, one of the first things I'll switch to is the additive mode, because if there is any black and white or gradient values on that light that are darker than the light behind you, will see them show up. By switching it to additive mode, it just becomes a nice little hotspot. So doing something like this allows you to create a nice complex, really easy but complex looking light source with zero textures and very, very little effort. So this is what the cropping tool or the frame is for. Again, though, by default, it's set up to just create a really simple black border. When the use alpha is on, it acts as a cropping tool on the shape. But when use alpha is off, or use composite as alpha, I should say, it becomes just a border system. Next in line is the linear gradients. These are very, very handy for creating contoured lights. They're exactly the same. There's an X gradient and a Y gradient. They do the exact same thing, and they are interchangeable because they are rotatable. They're just set up by default to be at 90 degrees to each other. So you've got a vertical and a horizontal axis. You can change the colors here, so you don't have to use black and white. You can use this to create subtle or more complex variations of light. You can also use the multiplier to create bands of light, which tends to make a little more sense when you're doing something like this. The contrast and scale controls allow you to create window slat lights, strip lights, things of that nature. But by far the most often way you will use it is, most people will use it anyway, is to create a gradation in the light source. You get a little bit more fall off in the light. I like to give it just a little bit of color. So it doesn't feel grayed out. So the scale will stretch it, offset will move it. So playing with that combination of those two will allow you to create pretty much whatever you need. The contrast, if you crank that up, you can get nice hard lines, and then you can shift it up and down. Of course, when the use alpha's composited is on, this also acts as a cropping line. So that's something to be aware of. But you can also use it to create gradient, nice little gradient fall-offs of light, where the darker part just disappears. This is the kind of case where, because we've got the gradients kind of doing what we wanted it to do, and we're, now that we're brightening up the light, the alpha isn't as intense as it was. So if we go back to the alpha controls, we can play around with the alpha contrast and brightness and knock it back out again. So it's a bit of a playing it back and forth because all these things interact and work together. Sometimes you end up juggling variables back and forth a little bit to get that right look in the light source and the right opacity in the alpha, etc. And the gradients. Now let's just reset this to default and set this to 1. Then you've got the rotation here, which again works in combination with the offset. The other gradient, the Y gradient, just works in the opposite direction. So between these two, you can also create some pretty funky light sources. And complex shapes. So you can use them to tone down a light, add fall off and gradients, or to create really interesting custom shapes. The last section in the gradients is the radial way of creating sort of a nice little vignette, a little more natural fall off. You can invert it if you wanted to create a dark spot in a light or a particular shape you're looking for. The inversion is often really useful. Actually, if you go into negative opacities, you can use it to create a bright spot, which you can see showing up here in the reflection. Because the light is pretty bright, it's not as obvious. Let's just take the intensity of the light plane down a bit. There we go. So you can use the inverted radial gradient to create light spots. Again, you've got color choices, so you can add a tint to it. When it's inverted, it does the opposite color. So blue will create yellow, yellow will create blue, etc. So if you wanted to have a blue hotspot, you would swing it over into the yellow. Or so if you go into positive opacity, it'll be yellow. So you can make harder and softer spots. Global scale, X and Y scale allow you to stretch. And then you've got the ability to move it around. So a very common use for me is exactly that, is the negative opacity to create a hotspot, scale it down. And sometimes what I'll do is stretch it really far out, and slide it to one side, drop the contrast, and kind of it can act in a similar way to the linear gradients do, but by playing with the scale and the shape, you can have a little bit more of a curved gradient fall off rather than a straight line. So you can see there's a bit of a bow to that shape, just a different level of control. And now we've got a frame going on. We've got a gradient happening. But the light plane is looking a little bit dull. This is where using some of those global adjustments can be handy. So now that we have this set up, we can now affect the brightness, and it's going to affect both at the same time. We can play with the contrast. And if there's any color in there at all, you can adjust the saturation. Here's where I could also add a little bit of a tint overall. So even if I'm using color in the gradients or in the base color, let's just pull up color. Oh, maybe my base color has a bit of blue. Now on top of that blue, I can add a little bit more color that's going to affect the gradients and the base color. That's just an extra level of control. And of course, you can invert the whole thing here, which is not super handy most of the time, but there is the odd time where it will help out. Again, global controls affect everything. And that's pretty much it for the functionality of all those tools. If you have a flip through some of the examples, if we go to, let's try one of the cameras here. complex examples. You can see how combining these things can create all kinds of different effects. Let's jump over there. So an example that I like is the LED ring light. And that's created just using all the same functions. If we go here to show only modified properties, we'll see what exactly has been changed. Unfortunately we can't, because this is saved as a child blueprint, so this won't show. This won't work because the properties are modified from the master, from the parent material, but they're not modified much from the child. So we just have to kind of have a quick flip through. So there's a bit of a base color. There's no texture happening here. Using the radial gradient is how I'm getting all those spots, and you can control the number of them there. The cutout in the middle, the black spot in the middle, is coming from the Gobo, which we're going to talk about next. So a bit of a tint, bit of a radial gradient action there, nothing too crazy. More of a basic light source. This is just a fairly standard, simple dome light or disc light, just really subtle gradient happening from noise, I believe. I think this one is, yeah, it's just a radial gradient. That's all that's really happening there. Nothing too crazy. And a bit of noise. Look at the noise. I think we'll see there's a change there. Yeah, so some noise. Let's just change that, bump that up so we can see what it is. Very soft, very diffused, but just enough to create some natural looking shape and a bit more realism in that light source. Let's look at the candle flame. And just turn this one off as well. So there you go. It's a pretty cheap and cheerful candle flame. At this close, it's not going to hold up all that well, but at a distance, it works quite well. And it is a combination of several things, but not a crazy amount. It's using a translucent, additive material only. It's a two-sided light plane, so you can see cast light from both sides, or cast reflections, I should say, and a bit of DI. It's using the point light to create the little pool of light around it. And the dish shape just doesn't super matter in this case. It just happens to be the shape I built it around. Again, we can control range of that. We didn't talk about the light controls yet, but if we look at the light controls, we've got access to the light attenuation radius. You can control that separately. But the effect itself is a combination. You can see there's some tweaks to the brightness and the saturation, but it's just a set of complex gradients, linear gradient, creating the base color, radial gradient, carving out the shape, point light color, and that's it. Not a lot. It doesn't take a lot, actually. It can be pretty straightforward. And noise is what's giving us the initial shape. So you can imagine if you animate these parameters, and all of the parameters are fully animatable, you can create a flickering candle flame pretty quickly. I think for the next version, I will set up animation controls within here, so we can animate the offset of the tiling and the scale, etc., and the rotation to create simple animations really quickly within the blueprint itself and not have to use a sequencer. But for now, if you wanted to create any animated lights, you just need to add them to a sequencer, and everything is accessible from that level. So I would highly recommend you take a few minutes if you've got the scene and just pull apart these lights and have a look at what they're all doing. And you'll start to get a really quick feel of exactly how this tool works and all the different shapes and things that you can create with it. I think the one that I want to talk about next is the Gobo, which we'll come back to this light in a minute once we've seen how the basic functions work. So let's have a look at the Gobo. We set this to all parameters again. We can activate it here. Again, the quickest way to get access to a limited set of options is just to type a keyword in. So we'll use that there. So the overall opacity is pretty straightforward. You can use it as a dimmer, more or less, for the light. These brightness controls and contrast controls, similar to the global adjustments, make more sense once something more complex is happening than just a solid black. Same thing with the invert, and two-sided will make sense as well in just a moment. So one of the simplest ways to use the Gobo is to activate it, select it as a subcomponent, and then start to move it around. So you can use it to, obviously it's a bit too big right there, so let's just grab the scale tool and shrink it down. Back to rotate. So by swinging it in and out, you can create fall off of light. Obviously you can use it to trim reflections as well, but it's more useful when controlling lighting. So let's use the spotlight on this one. Let's maybe just pull this line back a little bit. And grab our Gobo. So you can use it to crop in a light. And play around with the light patterns he creates on the ground, or just fade light where it's getting too bright. Like for example, on that white ball, it's pretty intense. So obviously that's doing quite a bit. But if we start to look at some of the gradient tools now, we can make a more subtle version of this. Skip over texture just for the time being. Let's grab one of the gradients and turn that on. Let's use the Y gradient this time. So with the contrast set very high, it's a hard edge, but by dropping the contrast down, we can create a soft, feathery sort of edge. And now use that to shape the light. You can see it's toning down the background light. Using it in this manner is pretty common with product type shots where you're using sometimes lights up very close to create specific reflections, and the intensity can be a little high. A good example of that is over in one of these other scenes here, where we've got this spotlight here. If I turn the Gobo off and on, is this the right one? Let me just see. Yeah. So there's without the Gobo, there's with the Gobo. So it's a nice way of just calming down lighting in a particular area. Just jump over and have a look at that light. Here. So you can see the Gobo is being set up. Let's just hide that one, shall we? Oh, that's part of it. So yeah, in this particular light, the Gobo has been dropped down and made into a small sort of neutral density filter sort of effect. Let's hide the light plane. And let's maybe hide the sprites. A little easier to see. Not that. So yeah, with the Gobo activated as a neutral density filter of sorts, it's just been dragged and repositioned around the light to create this natural fall off here. So if we use our move tool, we can fade the effect in and out. And by moving it forward and back, you can create harder and softer edges to that cast, to the cast shadow edge of the gobo, which is creating the shaded area in the shot. And this is where the excuse me, this is where the overall opacity as well can start to be useful. So if we go back to gobos, if we want to tone down the effect of this overall, we can start to drop it back. So now it's becoming like a quarter stop filter with a soft edge. So you can get really, really subtle effects. Of course, you can always invert it if you wanted to flip the area of effect around. And then the effect can also be faded side to side by rotating it. So it gives you a way of giving a nice controlled light, which can be difficult to do when lights are close because of the inverse fall off of light. As the light gets really close to a subject, sometimes in the immediate foreground of the light, it's very intense, but you need it to be that bright to get light across to the further parts of the set that you're lighting. So using filters this way, or using the gobos and neutral density filter this way, gives you a nice level of control, so you can even out the lighting and control where your fall off is across the shot. Of course, another use for this is to create cast shadow patterns. This is also a very common requirement. So if we were to take this same light, or same gobo, let's turn off the opacity effect and the neutral density, or sorry, the gradient that's creating that neutral density sort of effect. Let's grab the spotlight. So the spotlight controls, like all the other controls we'll have a quick look at in a sec, have been broken out to a set within the light itself, within the blueprint, that gives you control over the key elements that you generally need when you're tweaking lighting: inner and outer cone angle, the attenuation radius, and the shadow softness. The spotlight source length, while it has a big impact mainly on the specular reflection created by the light, we're not using that right now, but by changing that, we can also affect the cast shadow shape. So it's a useful tool still. But let's set it to a pretty hard shadow now. Let's just reset these back to default so that we can see what's going on inside that candle. And that one. So with the Gobo on, obviously it's not a lot is happening. Let's tighten up our cone angle, and let's turn off the Gobo for a sec. Great. And spotlight. So now if we go back to using our Gobo, and instead of putting a gradient in there, let's put a texture in. Let's put a noise texture in. And then sharpen, make it easy to see. You can grab the Gobo itself, bring it up in front of the light, and you can start to see what's happening here with the shape. The light projecting through that shape is creating mottled shadow patterns. The Gobo contrast. Can make those more or less defined. You can use the blur controls. All the same texture controls that we looked at before, rotating around. Again, these are all fully animatable properties. The hardness and softness of the shadow pattern that's being cast is partly controlled by the texture map, obviously, but also by the shadow sharpness of the spotlight itself, or whatever light happens to be doing it. Spotlight's just the most controllable one. But if we increase the softness of the shadow, we can also soften out the effect that way. So if you wanted to have a hard shadow from your light for whatever reason and soft projection of the pattern, that's entirely possible. to the Gobo controls. So we can turn off the texture. So we also have the same linear gradients, which we've seen before, to create that graduated effect if we wanted it. There's a radial gradient. This is actually easier to see if the light plane is back on, just because it's black on black there. There we go. Let's take the Gobo back in front of the light plane. Actually, the light plane position has been positioned forward for something I was playing around with earlier. But right now, as you can see, the light plane, the geometry shell, everything's in different places in space. If we want to reset any of that, we can just take the subcomponent and reset its transforms, and it'll go back to being where it's supposed to be. So everything that doesn't have that little reset arrow is in its default position. So right now, just the light itself, the Gobo is moved ahead of the light, which is what we want. But anyway, you can see there, whoops, you can see there the radial gradient effect happening. And we have the contrast controls, scale controls, so we can use that to create a secondary spotlight effect. And it can also be inverted. If you wanted to create a little dark spot in your light, or for example, as we have with that ring light on the other side here, using the Gobo to create that artificial ring light shape. If we turn that Gobo off, you'll see that the texture that's created on the light is a straightforward grid of radial spots. It's just the Gobo that gives you that look of a ring light. I'll look at that linear gradient again for a sec. Let's just reset everything here back to normal. So if we use the multiplier, we can create that sort of classic window light effect through a set of blinds. If we use both together, yeah, you can get any sort of mixed combination of effects. The frame does its job on the on the Gobo, similar to what it does on the light itself, but it's kind of useful as an extra cropping tool for sure. That's opacity to 1. So you can use it as a way of trimming in and creating soft edged effects. The further away it gets from the light, obviously, the harder that shadow is going to be. But yeah, so the variety of shapes that you can create through the cast shadow pattern of the Gobo and the light complexities itself is pretty endless. One advantage to using the Gobo as a way of creating your gradients on the light versus the light itself is that the Gobo will affect the cast light from the Unreal lights as well as the reflection and the global illumination kicked off from the light plane itself. Whereas the gradients, if you put them just on the light plane, it will graduate the reflection and the GI that's picked up from it, but it won't affect the cast shadow or the shape of the light from the Unreal light. So you have the advantage of being able to control them separately as well, especially if you move the Gobo in space relative to the light plane. So for example, if we want to have, well, let's just go back to a more simplified Gobo here. Let's go to our linear grads and reset this. Let's bring our contrast back down. Let's turn our frames off. So again, we have this sort of simple graduated light thing, and let's just reset our position as well. So everything's back to more normal. Okay, so we can use this, and it's going to affect both the light and the reflection right now, because the light source by default is slightly behind the gobo, and the gobo is in front of both the light plane and the light source. But if we wanted to have the light be graduated by this gobo as it is now, so we're getting a little bit of fall off there, but not have it affect the reflection, we can just grab the light plane and bring it slightly in front of the gobo, and then you don't have that problem anymore. You've got the light being tailored by the gobo, but the light plane and the reflection that it's creating are not. So with the combination of moving the elements independently and all the subtle controls you can build with the gradients, it's limitless what sort of custom and highly crafted lighting you can create using the UltraLight. Also included with UltraLight is the lighting demo level, which has 3 setups for you to check out as well. So we've got this concept car setup, car courtesy of Rowan Simpson. Cool little model. It's not a full model intended for general use. It's just a lighting demo setup here. So the model is incomplete and the materials are a little bit rough and ready, but it gets the idea across. But have a look at the way the lights are set up here. Again, using the gobo to create that interesting cast pattern. This also shows in one of those things that I was mentioning before that I like to do, which is have 2 lights active. We've got the spotlight and the rect light. So the spotlight is creating the cast shadow pattern through the gobo, and the rect light is creating just that little bit of extra blue warm fill, cool fill, which makes it feel a little bit more like an outdoor lighting effect. So if we look at how that's being done, we scroll down here to the UltraLight's Unreal Lighting section. Each of the lights has its own independent controls, as mentioned. So they are driven by the global color, but each light's color can also be controlled separately. So you can have the spotlight and the rect light and the point light all doing slightly different things. So you can see I've added some blue to the rect light component. It also has a shortened set of the default parameters available. Barndoor, angle, length, source width, source height. These are all basically working by default. The source width is driven by the scale of the light. So you can grab the scale tool and adjust the blueprint of the light itself, and it will make sure that the rect light stays in keeping. But for whatever reason, if you wanted to have it be larger or smaller than your UltraLight reflection plane, this is how you would do that. Just set it to anything greater or less than 100. But by having some blue in here, we can create a light that's creating a warm highlight, main highlight, and its own cool fill. The intensities are again up on this section above, and the reason those are broken out separately is that it's very common to be playing with them back and forth amongst each other. So I just set them all up in one spot. But you can see if I turn this to 0, the spotlight is creating just that shape there, and then adding the rect light. It's just that little bit of kick into the blue fill into the pattern of the shadows that you're seeing through the camera. That gives it that nice, slightly natural feel without having to add a second light and position it around the scene. And having it all in one light means I can move this spotlight around. I can change the pattern and change the shape, change the color of the warmth. And the fill light will always be kept locked to it. Anyway, take a few minutes to tear apart these lights. Most of them are pretty straightforward. They're, representing common studio type lighting, not trying to create anything too crazy. We go here to the can, for example, simple product shot kind of setup. Simple in relative terms. These sorts of things are actually a lot trickier than I think many people realize. If you've worked in a photography or film set before, then you'll know that lighting is a lot more complex than most people understand out of the box. So you've got overhead light and then a secondary light that's creating a little extra hotspot that's creating this piece here. I just turn that off. You can see it's adding a little something to that light to give it a bit more kick, a bit more shape. Same thing that's happening to the reflection on this side. That's a dual light setup. So there's one light that's creating, there we are. the main reflection, and then this little secondary highlight that's adding just that little hard light along the edge. And then we've got some negative fill. You can use simple geometry to create this, but by using the UltraLight, you've got all the complex material tools built into it. If you want a graduated shape to this reflector card, you don't need to create a separate material with a black surface or a gray surface or whatever surface and create gradients to create soft edge light blockers. You can simply turn off the light plane, turn off the lights as I have here, use the Gobo, and then use all the tools that are built in for the Gobo to create sort of interesting shapes or different shapes in your light blockers really, really quickly. One of the other things that I do like about using the light itself as a light blocker is you can have it act as a blocker and still cast illumination. In this case, you see the Gobo's been lined up with the light facing the opposite way, so we just need to rotate that around. And now we can bring some light into the scene if we wanted to. Because by default the Gobo is in front of the light, we just need to move it slightly behind. So if you wanted to have a little bit of light coming through around it for whatever reason, you could definitely do that as well. I think that should give a pretty good overview of all the functions and parameters of the UltraLight. There are obviously limitless combinations possible, and I'm really looking forward to seeing what everyone else does with the UltraLight. Feel free to post any questions or feedback in the comments here or join the Discord community. The link is below. The UltraLight is available now on the marketplace. That link for that is also below. Thanks everyone for your time and have fun lighting your projects.